My name is Ethan, and I used to be a sound designer for independent horror films, a job that requires a bizarre intimacy with silence and noise. But nothing in my professional life prepared me for the true, deep-seated dread I found when I inherited my great-aunt Elara's home in rural Maine. That it wasn't old in the charming, creaky way. It was an architectural anomaly, a brutalist monolith of dark wood and stained concrete, built in the late 1960s, completely isolated by a perimeter of dense, skeletal pine forest. The air inside always felt 2 degrees colder than the air outside, and the silence was the first thing that broke me. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the weight of it, a suffocating pressure that seemed to absorb any noise I made. I arrived in late October. The will was simple. The house and its contents were mine, provided I live in it for at least 3 months. Elara, a woman I barely remembered, had been a recluse, a minor figure in the world of theoretical physics who published one obscure, self-printed monograph titled The Persistence of Echoes. The first week was a blur of unpacking and attempting to normalize the abnormal. I set up my high-end audio workstation in the spacious, windowless basement, convinced I could filter out the oppressive quiet and focus on work. It was in the basement that I discovered the house's first secret. Behind a stack of dusty, empty magnetic tapes, I found a small, recessed wooden panel. It wasn't latched or locked, just snug. I pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside was a compartment lined with sound-dampening foam, and in the center sat a single, archaic piece of equipment. It looked like a cross between a Geiger counter and an antique radio tuner, housed in a thick, metallic shell. It had one large, glowing red display that was perpetually stuck on a 4-digit number, 4.09. Below the display, a single, heavy-duty toggle switch was labeled, in faded white paint. Input, ambient/output. Receptor. I flipped the switch to a deafening burst of white noise erupted from the device. Pure, digital static. My hands flew to my ears, and I fumbled to switch it back off. The silence returned, more absolute than before. I spent the next 3 days studying the thing, taking it apart, then carefully putting it back together. It wasn't a radio. It had no antenna, no speaker, and no power cable. It ran on an internal, self-sustaining battery unit I couldn't identify. The only thing I managed to figure out was the device's true nature. It was a highly specialized, ultra-low frequency recording unit, designed to pick up vibrations and electromagnetic signatures below the threshold of human hearing. On the 4th day, I worked up the nerve to turn it on again, but this time, I connected it to my professional-grade digital recorder via a shielded output port I found on its side. I flipped the switch to ambient and started recording. For 2 hours, the only thing captured was that thick, empty static. Just the digital hiss of nothingness. Then, at 2:17 a.m., a new sound bled into the recording. It was minute, subtle, completely masked by the static on playback, but visible as a distinct waveform spike on the monitor. It was a pulse. Thump. I isolated the segment, filtered the static, and amplified the sound 1,000-fold. The sound was not the common thump of a settling house or dripping water. It was wet, organic, and incredibly deep. Thump. Thump. It was the unmistakable sound of a heartbeat. Slow, heavy, and resonant, as if it were beating not in a chest cavity, but in the thick, concrete walls of the house itself. And it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I sat there, headphones on, watching the waveform of the static heart beat out its silent, rhythmic dread, and I knew. Elara hadn't just built a house. She had built a receptacle, and whatever was beating inside her walls, was finally being heard, and the silent countdown on the device, the number 4.09, hadn't budged. The static heartbeat. Once I had isolated it, I couldn't unhear it. It was slow, about 38 beats per minute, but each thump felt like a low-frequency punch to my sternum, even after I took the headphones off. The air in the basement suddenly felt viscous, like breathing through liquid. My sound designer's brain, however, wouldn't let the terror incapacitate me. If it was a heartbeat, it must have a source. I pulled out my spectrum analyzer, a sophisticated piece of gear I usually use to map complex soundscapes. I set it to track the specific ultra-low frequency, ULF, of the pulse, a frequency so deep, bats wouldn't even register it. I moved the sensor across the basement's concrete floor and the surrounding walls. The signal intensity didn't fluctuate in a focused way. It was uniformly loud across the entire structure. The whole house was vibrating, thrumming with this internal, biological rhythm. "It's not a spot," I muttered, pacing the perimeter. "It's the structure itself." I remembered my great-aunt Elara's obscure monograph, The Persistence of Echoes. I found the self-published, spiral-bound book hidden in a locked safe beneath a loose floorboard in her study. The pages were filled with densely written equations and bizarre diagrams. Most of it was meaningless to me, but one section, labeled Architecture and Resonance, caught my eye. The true silence is not achieved by eliminating external sound, but by containing internal vibration. If a structure can be engineered to absorb and amplify a specific ULF signature, a rhythmic signature, perhaps akin to the fundamental frequency of a living organism, that frequency, once introduced, will become the soul of the frame. The house will not just hold the echo, it will become the heart. A cold sweat broke out on my neck. Elara hadn't just built a bunker. She had constructed a massive, sound-dampening acoustic echo chamber, perfectly tuned to a biofrequency. And something, or someone, had introduced that rhythmic signature. I went back to the cryptic recorder, the one stuck on 4.09. I tried hitting the toggle switch to the other, terrifying setting. Output. Receptor. I didn't dare connect my recorder this time. The receptor output, I realized, was designed to inject sound, not record it. It was an input for the house, designed to resonate with that awful ULF beat. Instead of flipping the switch, I focused on the display, 4.09. I checked my calendar. Today was November 4th. The number didn't represent a date. It represented time. I went back to Elara's notes, frantically flipping through diagrams. There, scribbled in the margin next to a complex wave diagram, was a note. The cycle is slow. The heart requires 12 phases to complete its full resonance. The current phase is only maintained until the moment the internal pressure exceeds the capacity for absorption. At that point, the core will activate. The window is 9 days and 4 hours. 9 days and 4 hours. 4.09. The countdown wasn't hours and minutes. It was days and hours. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The device wasn't static. It was active. I had only been in the house for less than a week. The full 3 months I was required to stay here was irrelevant. I had 4 days and 9 hours before whatever Elara had caged within the walls. The core, that required 12 phases to reach full resonance, would reach a critical point. I looked at the recorder. The static heartbeat was still pulsing its slow, dreadful rhythm. I looked at the windowless, oppressive basement. I was trapped in a timeline dictated by a dead physicist and a monster's slow, structural pulse. I had to find out what was inside. I had to find the core, but as I reached for my gear, a new, tiny sound registered on my monitor. A high-pitched, metallic screech layered faintly over the ULF thump. I filtered and amplified it sounded exactly like a fingernail, slowly, agonizingly, being dragged across reinforced concrete. And it was coming from the center of the basement floor. The metallic screech. It wasn't loud, not like the static burst, but it was far more insidious. It was the sound of something trying to get out. And it was coming from beneath the thick concrete slab of the basement floor. My heart hammered a chaotic rhythm against the slow, deliberate thrum of the house. For days and 9 hours. That was all I had left. I grabbed a heavy-duty masonry drill and a powerful flashlight. The basement floor was a solid, unyielding expanse of dark gray, reinforced concrete. There were no seams, no obvious trapdoors, just a monolithic pour. But the screech, it was localized, directly beneath the center of the room. I knelt, pressing my ear to the cold concrete, straining to hear past the omnipresent ULF heartbeat. Nothing. The sound only registered on my sensitive audio equipment. It was too high frequency, too subtle for the naked ear. I set up my microphone array, triangulating the source of the screech. The point converged to a circle about 3 feet in diameter, dead center in the basement. With a grim resolve, I began to drill. The concrete dust plumed, thick and choking. The drill bit whined, sparking against the aggregate, but after what felt like an eternity, I had only managed to bore an inch into the slab. It was impossibly thick. Then, the drill bit hit something harder. Not rebar, but something metallic and impossibly dense. It let out a piercing shriek as the bit skated across its surface, leaving a deep scratch. I pulled back the drill, my hand trembling. I shone the flashlight into the shallow hole. Instead of concrete, I saw a polished, obsidian black surface. It wasn't metal, not exactly. It was a material I'd never encountered, reflecting the light like dark glass, but feeling as solid as steel. And it was radiating a subtle, almost imperceptible warmth. As I stared, a faint, almost microscopic, crack appeared on the obsidian surface within the drill hole. It was hairline thin, yet it pulsed with a faint, internal crimson glow, synchronized with the house's ULF heartbeat. Thump flash. Thump flash. The screech wasn't a fingernail. It was the sound of this internal core, slowly, painstakingly, being scratched and stressed from within. My great Aunt Elara's notes flashed through my mind. The internal pressure exceeds the capacity for absorption. At that point, the core will activate. This obsidian-like material was the core, and it was expanding, pushing against its concrete prison. The scratches were a symptom of its growth, its struggle. I needed to see more. I abandoned the drill and found Elara's old workshop, a room filled with strange tools and even stranger diagrams. Among them was an industrial-grade concrete saw. Heavy, dangerous, and loud. Wearing a respirator and heavy-duty gloves, I started the saw. The roar was deafening, a brutal assault on the house's oppressive silence. I cut a circle, carefully following the 3-foot diameter I had triangulated. The process was agonizingly slow. Sparks flew, dust billowed, and the air filled with the stench of pulverized rock. The entire house vibrated with the saw's immense power, threatening to overwhelm the subtle ULF pulse. Finally, after hours of grueling work, the circular slab of concrete separated. I leveraged it with a crowbar, and with a guttural groan of displaced weight, it lifted. Beneath it was a perfectly smooth, jet-black cylinder, 3 feet in diameter, extending downwards into an abyss of engineered darkness. The surface was the same obsidian-like material I had found in the drill hole, and it was humming. A deep, resonant hum, just barely audible over the residual ringing in my ears from the SAW. I shined my flashlight down the dark shaft. The hum intensified, and the internal crimson light pulsed more brightly. The black surface was completely smooth, but as I looked closer, I saw etched, hair-thin lines, like a spiderweb of microscopic fissures, spreading across its surface. Each line glowed with that same sinister red light. Then, from the depths of the cylinder, a new sound began to emanate. It wasn't the slow, deep thump of the house's heartbeat, nor the high-pitched screech. This was something else entirely. It was a low, guttural drone, rising slowly in pitch, like a chorus of primordial voices trapped in a deep well. It resonated through my bones, vibrating my teeth, making my eyes water. And the display on the archaic recorder in the corner, still stuck on 4.09, began to subtly flicker. The first digit, the 0, changed. It became a 3.03.09.3 days and 9 hours. The countdown had begun to accelerate. The new number glowed mockingly, 3.09. 3 days and 9 hours. The acceleration confirmed my worst fear. The core's expansion wasn't linear, it was reactive. Cutting into the floor, disrupting its containment, had sped up the inevitable. The silent, guttural drone emanating from the shaft was the sound of a system under immense, hostile pressure. I aimed my flashlight down the obsidian cylinder. The black material seemed to absorb the light, only allowing the internal crimson fissures to glow. The shaft appeared bottomless, yet the sound, that low, inhuman drone, was undeniably rising from its depths, like a choir singing in negative space that I realized I couldn't climb down. The sides were impossibly slick, and the depth was too great. I needed to interact with the core without becoming part of its resonance chamber. That I returned to my workstation and retrieved the static heart recorder. I focused on the toggle switch. Input, ambient/output. Receptor. Elara's notes had described the core as needing 12 phases to complete its full resonance. The number 12 was key. The device, I suspected, was not just a recorder. It was a phase controller designed to manage the core's rhythmic signature. If I could inject a specific frequency, an anti-frequency, into the shaft using the receptor output, maybe I could stabilize the internal pressure and slow the countdown. But what frequency? I played back the recording of the house's ULF heartbeat. The waveform was perfectly periodic, slow, heavy, and dreadfully monotonous. My spectrum analyzer gave me the exact frequency, 1.15 Hz. According to basic physics, to cancel a wave, you need to introduce an equal wave with an opposite phase, 180 ring operator out of phase. But the core wasn't just a sound wave. It was a complex ULF signature, a biofrequency amplified by architecture. I decided to try the simplest intervention first. I connected the recorder's receptor output to a heavy-duty, shielded cable and dropped the end of the cable down the cylindrical shaft. I took a deep breath, flipped the device to receptor, and then, using a secondary function I'd only just decoded from Elara's complex diagrams, I introduced a carefully calibrated 1.15 Hz tone, 180 ring operator. Out of phase. The result was immediate and violent. The gentle thrumming of the house didn't stop, it ceased. The walls seemed to hold their breath, and the oppressive silence of the house returned with a vengeance, so intense it felt like my eardrums were being sucked inward. Then, the core screamed. The guttural drone from the shaft transformed into a high-pitched, tearing shriek, an ear-splitting sound that was both electronic and organic, like tearing meat with a rusty saw. The crimson fissures in the obsidian cylinder flared, bathing the basement in pulsing, sickly red light. The countdown display went wild, cycling through numbers with impossible speed. 0, 3.0 to 1.5, that I had not stabilized the core. I had provoked it. The anti-frequency was perceived as an attack. Panicked, I flipped the toggle back to ambient. The screaming stopped instantly, replaced by the immediate, heavier return of the ULF heartbeat. The countdown settled on a terrifying new number. The display glowed with a sickly yellow, 0, 1.0, 3.1 day and 3 hours. The clock was accelerating exponentially. I looked down the shaft. The obsidian surface was no longer merely cracked. Where the shielded cable had been dropped, the surface had liquefied, a patch of black, viscous goo that dripped back down into the darkness. And from that patch of goo, a single, horrifying sound emerged, clear and sharp above the drone, and the thrum.it was a whisper. A dry, hissing whisper, devoid of breath or humanity, a sound that seemed to be scraped from the deepest part of the earth. The voice was unmistakably female, speaking in flawless, academic English, echoing my great-aunt Elara's. Monograph. Phase 4 is insufficient. The echo requires absorption. 1 day and 3 hours. The voice, Elara's academic voice, hissing up from the liquefied goo on the obsidian core, shattered my last rational defense. It was no longer a science problem. It was an entity, a consciousness trapped within the architectural prison. Phase 4 is insufficient. The echo requires absorption. I scrambled back, knocking over a stack of Elara's magnetic tapes. The fear was a living thing now, crawling up my throat. But the core's voice had also provided a horrifying clue. Phase 4. I rushed back to the monograph, the persistence of echoes, flipping frantically to the architecture and resonance section. I found a complex diagram mapping 12 nodes in the house, each labeled with a Roman numeral. I threw 12 next to Phase 4. Elara had scribbled a note. Requires a greater kinetic introduction. The frequency must be fed, not opposed. The absorption must be total, or the release will be catastrophic. Kinetic introduction. The frequency must be fed. The core wasn't being contained by the house. It was being starved. My anti-frequency had acted like a shock, spiking the pressure and accelerating the countdown. That I needed to find the input for the core, not the receptor. I looked at the arcane recorder again. The switch, input, ambient/output, receptor. The ambient setting was what I'd been using, listening to the house's heartbeat. But there was a hidden port, masked by a removable panel, labeled simply INJ. This had to be it. The injection port, designed to feed the core whatever kinetic introduction Elara had devised. But what did the core consume? I searched the workshop again. Amidst the strange physics equipment and tools, I found a sealed, lead-lined box. Inside, resting on velvet, was a single object, an antique metronome. It wasn't a normal wind-up device. Its pendulum was a slender rod of the same unsettling, black obsidian material as the core, and its base contained complex wiring and a small, digital display that was currently blank. That I remembered Elara's words about the ULF signature being akin to the fundamental frequency of a living organism. The metronome wasn't for time. It was for rhythm. It was a custom-engineered device to generate the exact frequency the core needed to stabilize its phase transition. The core needed a controlled heartbeat. I connected the metronome to the INJ port on the static heart recorder. The display on the metronome flickered to life, showing a number, 1.15 BPM, beats per minute, exactly the frequency of the house's ULF heartbeat. I flipped the recorder to input, ambient. then back to output. Receptor. The action primed the system for a controlled injection. As soon as the metronome was connected and the system primed, a second voice hissed up from the shaft, louder this time, less academic, and filled with cold, seething hunger. It was the same female voice, but distorted, layered, and utterly inhuman. The phase requires a completion signature. The 12th note. You have the frequency. Now, provide the context. The context? The 1.15 Hz frequency was the heartbeat. But what was the completion signature? I looked down at the obsidian pendulum on the metronome, and for a terrifying second, I saw a reflection in its polished surface. A fleeting, shadowy image of a woman, with eyes wide and screaming, instantly gone. Then, I noticed the crucial detail on the metronome's control panel. Next to the frequency setting, there was a small input slot, the size of an old microcassette. It was empty. Elara hadn't just created a frequency generator. She had created a rhythm replicator. The core didn't just need a heartbeat. It needed a specific heartbeat. The realization brought a wave of nausea. The house needed the acoustic signature of whatever poor soul Elara had used to initiate the core, the original living organism whose rhythmic signature became the soul of the frame. I had less than 1 day remaining. I had to find a recording, a microcassette, a digital file, the original echo. I spun around, scanning the chaotic room. And there, on a shelf, above a dark workbench, nestled between two thick binders, was a single, unmarked, dust-coated microcassette tape that it felt cold to the touch. The cassette was labeled, in Elara's elegant script, the initial phase, 1.15. 1 day and 3 hours. The clock was afire in the corner of my eye. The microcassette, marked the initial phase, 1.15, was the final, terrifying piece of Elara's puzzle. It was the context the trapped entity demanded. The original, sonic blueprint of the life force absorbed by the house that my hand shook as I inserted the cassette into the specialized slot on the metronome's control panel. The metronome clicked, confirming the cassette was recognized. The tiny digital display next to the frequency showed a new message. Phase SIG. Active. I took a deep, steadying breath. This was the moment of truth. If Elara's complex theories were right, feeding the core the exact rhythm it craved, at the exact frequency it was resonating, should stabilize it, perhaps reversing the runaway countdown. If I was wrong, I was feeding a monster. I reached for the static heart recorder. The toggle was still set to ambient. I had to flip it to receptor to initiate the injection, but doing so would effectively turn the metronome's signal into an input for the house's entire structure. As my fingers brushed the switch, the female voice from the core hissed, anticipating my move. Do you know what you are feeding? The absorption is not passive. It is an act of translation. The rhythm of one becomes the geometry of all. I ignored the chilling warning and slammed the toggle switch to output. Receptor. The metronome immediately came to life. The obsidian pendulum began to swing, slow and heavy, at 1.15 beats per second. A low-frequency thrum filled the basement, overlaying the house's existing ULF heartbeat. It was a rhythmic duel. As the metronome swung, the cassette began to play, and a new sound, the completion signature, was injected into the system. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was the clear, desperate sound of a woman weeping. Soft, shuddering sobs, followed by labored, hyperventilating breaths. The sound of a person in profound distress. The weeping was amplified and fed into the house's core. The low, monstrous drone from the shaft began to harmonize with it. The combination was horrific. an architectural hum merging with pure, human anguish. The countdown display on the recorder froze. Then, the number began to climb backward, slowing slightly. 0, 1.0, 3, 1.07, 1.11. It was working. The core was accepting the phase signature, and the acceleration was reversing. The immediate danger had passed, at least for the moment that I watched the Obsidian cylinder. The patch of black goo retracted, and the fissures, which had glowed a furious crimson, faded to a faint, stable orange. The whole house felt less oppressive, the air just a little thinner. After a few minutes, the countdown stabilized at a new, fixed number, 4.00.4 days. The time needed to complete phase 4 had been reset that I reached out to turn off the injection. I had to stop the weeping, to stop feeding the core that sound of agony. But as I reached the metronome, the core spoke again, this time with a voice that was calm, lucid, and terrifyingly clear. It was Elara's voice, devoid of hiss or distortion. "Thank you, Ethan. I was incomplete. My heart was weak. You have provided the memory. Now, phase 5 begins. The requirement for the next phase is not the rhythm of anguish, but the signature of compliance." The weeping stopped instantly as the cassette reached its end. The metronome's display flashed a new requirement. Phase V, new signature required. And then, the countdown device, instead of returning to a simple day count, shifted. The main display showed 4.00, but below it, a smaller secondary display, previously dark, lit up that IT showed the image of a rotating, wireframe human hand. The calm, cold voice of Elara echoed from the empty shaft. "You are the sound designer, Ethan. You understand how to create a perfect sound from nothing. To complete phase 5, you must provide the sound of your own agreement." I looked at my hand, then at the image of the wireframe hand on the display. The core wasn't just demanding a sound. It was demanding an action, a recording of my submission. And if I didn't comply, the 4-day clock would surely accelerate again that I had stabilized the core, but in doing so, I had merely confirmed my role in Elara's 12-part experiment. The countdown was stalled at 4.00, but the terms of the truce were horrifying. The core, using Elara's voice, demanded the signature of compliance to initiate phase 5, with the secondary display flashing the wireframe image of a rotating hand. "You are the sound designer, Ethan," the cold voice repeated, resonating from the depths of the Obsidian shaft. "You understand how to create a perfect sound from nothing. To complete phase 5, you must provide the sound of your own agreement." I understood the immediate threat, for days was an illusion. The countdown was contingent upon my action. If I resisted, the acceleration would resume, leading to the catastrophic release Elara had warned about. I looked at my audio equipment. How do you record compliance? A verbal agreement was too simple. Elara was a physicist obsessed with resonance and frequency. The signature had to be more intimate, more physical. The wireframe hand on the display provided the chilling answer. It was a digital model, and I noticed tiny, glowing points on the joints of the index finger and thumb. The core didn't want my voice. It wanted the sound of my will breaking. I took the microcassette out of the metronome, the one containing the sound of pure anguish. I needed a new recording medium. I grabbed a fresh, high-density digital recorder, setting the input to capture a narrow, high-frequency bandwidth. I knelt by the shaft, the drone from the core a low, expectant hum. I held my hand out over the slick, black surface, trying to mimic the posture of the wireframe model. "I need to know what you want," I whispered, my voice thick with dread. The response was immediate, an amplified thought that scraped against my mind rather than my ears. The initiation phase was anguish, the sound of what is lost. The compliance phase is subordination, the sound of what is surrendered. Your agreement must be final. Your body must generate the acoustic wave of relinquishment. My eyes fixed on the two glowing points on the wireframe hand. The joints of the index finger and thumb. I pressed the record button on my device. With a profound, nauseating certainty, I knew what the core needed. The physical sound of a commitment that couldn't be taken back. That I extended my left hand over the obsidian, closing my eyes. I placed my right hand over the joints of my index finger and thumb, bracing myself. And then, with a sharp, sickening twist, I intentionally dislocated the joints. The sound that erupted was a wet, grinding snap, followed by a raw, involuntary scream that was instantly swallowed by the dense acoustic environment of the basement. That I lay on the floor, gasping. The agonizing throbbing in my hand competing with the relentless 1.15 hertz thrum of the house. The pain was absolute, but I had the recording. I rushed back to the workstation, my left hand hanging uselessly. I edited the recording, isolating the high-frequency snap of the joints breaking, filtering out my scream, leaving only the sound of bone and ligament tearing free. It was a clean, sharp, acoustic signature of surrender. That I saved the file, transferred it to a new storage card, and, using the adapter, inserted the card into the metronome slot. The metronome immediately recognized the file. The display flashed. Phase V, compliance signature detected. I didn't wait. I slammed the recorder back to output. Receptor, the metronome activated, swinging its obsidian pendulum. The ULF thrumming intensified, and then the high-frequency snap of my broken joints was injected, amplified, and spread throughout the structure. This time, there was no violence, no screaming. Instead, the house felt like it was sighing. A deep, long, audible expulsion of air pressure. The internal orange glow in the fissures of the core faded to a stable, almost comforting blue. The countdown display cycled once, then settled on a new configuration. 05.00 Phase V was complete. I had bought myself 5 days, but the voice returned, calmer, more appreciative than before, a true mimicry of a satisfied human. Excellent, Ethan. The phase transition is successful. The house has absorbed your submission. Now, for Phase 6, we require perspective. The next echo must be spatial, not acoustic. You must show me the structure from the outside. The house needs to see itself. The small secondary display changed. The wireframe hand vanished, replaced by a simple, blinking text prompt. Primary focal point. External view. Node 8 required. The core wanted a video feed, and it wanted it from a specific location in the dark, skeletal pine forest surrounding the house. The house was now demanding to see its own monstrous silhouette. 5 days. My left hand was splinted and throbbing, a constant, sharp reminder of the price of temporary survival. The house, stabilized by my compliance, felt eerily calm, its ULF heartbeat now a soothing, low blue hum. But the core's new demand, primary focal point, external view, Node 8 required, was a clear directive for Phase 6 that the entity wanted to see itself. It wanted perspective. I referenced Elara's monograph again. The diagram of the 12 nodes showed Node 8 was located approximately 300 yards due northwest of the house, deep in the dense pine forest. It wasn't just a random spot. The diagram showed complex, intersecting lines of energy converging there, marked with the cryptic term, the harmonic convergence of exterior sight. I gathered my equipment, a rugged, night vision-enabled camera with a wide-angle lens, a powerful satellite transmitter for the feed, and a handheld GPS tracker. The sun had long set, leaving the Maine wilderness in a state of absolute, oppressive blackness. The shadows of the skeletal pines outside the window looked like elongated, silent sentinels. Stepping out of the house was a profound relief and a crushing terror simultaneously. The silence outside was real, cold, and brittle, a stark contrast to the dense, warm, manufactured silence of the basement. The house, a brutalist monument of dark wood and concrete, loomed behind me, a massive, silent, geometric predator. Following the GPS coordinates on Elara's map, I navigated the uneven, needle-covered ground. The forest was thick, the trees packed so closely that moonlight rarely touched the ground. The only light was the beam of my flashlight, cutting through the swirling mist. The deeper I went, the more the trees seemed to twist, their branches like bony, grasping claws. I focused solely on the GPS display, ignoring the faint, unidentifiable rustling sounds that tracked my movements just outside the flashlight's periphery. Finally, the GPS beeped, indicating I had reached Node 8. That the location was marked by a bizarre, natural anomaly. 12 massive pine trees, impossibly old and thick, had grown in a perfect, equidistant circle. The ground inside the circle was bare, covered only in flat, smooth river stones. A circle of utter desolation within the chaos of the forest. The air here was even colder, and I could hear no forest sounds, only the faint, distant, cyclical thrum of the house's ULF heartbeat being carried on the night air. I set up the camera on a sturdy tripod at the exact center of the stone circle, positioning it to capture the house's full silhouette, a looming, dark shape visible just through the gap in the trees. I linked the camera to the satellite transmitter and established a feedback to a monitor in the basement. With the camera running, I pulled out a small, specialized sensor I'd brought, an electromagnetic field, EMF, reader. The EMF reader immediately started spiking, screaming with high-energy readings that were off the charts. The center of this circle wasn't just a focal point for sight. It was a node of immense energy. Suddenly, the house's distant blue thrumming intensified. The blue light, visible through the few basement windows, pulsed violently. That I heard the voice again, not through the transmitter, but carried by the EMF field itself. A sharp, cold whisper right next to my ear. "Closer, Ethan. We need to see the detail. The perspective is incomplete." I looked at the camera feed on my monitor. The house was clear, but the core demanded detail. I adjusted the zoom. I focused the camera lens tightly on the central, upper window of the house, the window of Elara's second-floor study. As soon as the lens locked onto the window, the EMF spike around me shot to max capacity. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, on the monitor feed, the window of Elara's study, which I knew to be dark and empty, suddenly lit up from within, and standing there, looking directly into the camera's lens, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, dressed in a long, dark dress. That it was Elara. She wasn't a shadow or a reflection. Her eyes, wide and unervingly black, stared right at me. At the camera, the eye of the core. A slow, chilling smile spread across her face, a smile of terrible, intellectual triumph. The voice crackled in my ear again, filled with triumph. Phase 6, complete. The house sees itself. Now, we proceed to Phase 7, the mirror. The camera feed instantly went dark. The countdown display on the handheld tracker, which was linked to the main unit, cycled wildly and then stabilized 0.07.007 days. I had bought more time, but I had shown the core its face, and now, Elara's smiling, terrifying image was burned into my memory, and the core was demanding a mirror. I stumbled back into the basement, dragging the camera gear. The image of Elara's cold, triumphant smile burned into my retinas. Her face, staring from an empty window, had been the core's way of saying, I am here. I am the structure. My left hand ached with a deep, pulsing pain, the signature of my compliance. 7 days. That was the core's concession. The current directive glowed in soothing, menacing blue. Phase 7. The mirrored, I went straight to Elara's study, the site of the apparition. The room was dark, stale, and untouched since her death. The large window where she had appeared was just glass and night. No residual energy, no flicker of light. That I consulted the persistence of echoes. Elara's notes for Phase 7 were sparse, but terrifyingly precise. The house has seen its geometry. It must now see its potential. The mirror is the translation surface, the final interface between the resonant frequency and the visual cortex. It requires a specific image to complete the harmonic translation. I knew the mirror wouldn't be a standard glass object. It would be something integrated into the house's fabric. The entire room was paneled in the same dark, oppressive wood as the rest of the monolith. Recalling the obsidian core in the basement, I grabbed a high-frequency sensor and began scanning the paneling. Most of the wood was inert, but in the center of the largest wall, directly opposite the door, the sensor screamed with the ULF signature of the house that I pushed against the panel. It didn't budge. I used a utility knife to scrape away a thin layer of the dark stain, and beneath it, I found it. The same polished, jet-black obsidian composite as the core. A 4-foot square of pure, unreflecting darkness, perfectly disguised. This was the mirror. The translation surface. I brought my face close to the cold, black surface. It didn't reflect my image. Instead, I saw a subtle, shifting distortion. The ambient light of the room rendered as a constant, shimmering blue static, the color of the current phase. It was reflecting the sound of the house, not the light of the room. As I stared, the obsidian began to warm. The low, resonant thrum of the house's heartbeat intensified through the panel, vibrating the air in the room. Elara's calm voice emanated from the mirror itself, the sound coming from the surface, not the shaft. The mirror is ready, Ethan. Phase 7 requires the final ingredient for the visual echo, an honest, uninhibited reflection of its purpose. It requires the image of fear. The obsidian surface flickered, and the static cleared, revealing not my face, but a vague, swirling internal image, like viewing smoke inside a black glass box. The core was demanding a visual input, a recording, a projection, an actual image of terror to complete the phase. Suddenly, the screen on my digital recorder, which I'd left on a nearby desk, came to life. It was playing back the video feed I'd just captured from Note 8. The video focused on Elara's study window. The mirror spoke again, sharper this time. No, not my fear, Ethan. The house has absorbed mine. It needs a new energy signature. The image of the external threat. The image of another's fear. Bring me a living reflection of terror. The countdown display in the basement, which I could see on a small linked monitor, pulsed from 7.00 down to 6.23. The clock was already ticking, and the core was clearly impatient for its visual meal. I looked at the obsidian mirror. The swirling smoke inside solidified for a moment, and I saw a fleeting, high-definition image, a child's wide, horrified eye, staring at something beyond the frame. The mirror was demanding a victim. I was completely isolated, miles from civilization. But then I remembered the local sheriff, Deputy Harris, who had stopped by just yesterday to confirm I was settled in, promising to return in a few days to check on the eccentric new resident. A few days. The core needed its image of terror now that I had to find a way to trick the mirror to provide a substitute image that would satisfy the cores. Requirement: install the countdown, or Deputy Harris would walk right into Elara's final, horrifying experiment. 6 days and 23 hours. The countdown was the only reality, relentlessly shrinking on the monitor. I couldn't allow the core to use Deputy Harris. The demand was clear, a living reflection of terror. I paced the study, my broken hand throbbing, staring at the unsettling Obsidian mirror. It was a surface designed not to reflect light, but to absorb psychic and acoustic energy. I needed an image that carried the genuine resonance of pure, survival-level fear that I realized I couldn't manufacture this. I was a sound designer, not an actor. My own fear was contaminated by intellectual understanding. The core would see through a fake. I had to find a true, recorded echo of primal terror that I rushed back to the basement, to the chaotic archives of Elara's work. She had not only built the house, she had obsessively documented its construction and, more disturbingly, its inputs that I tore through drawers filled with magnetic tapes, audio spools, and old computer disks. Finally, I found a small, unmarked box in the corner, lined with sound-dampening foam, similar to the one that held the original static heart device. Inside was a series of small, transparent slides, high-resolution photographic negatives. They weren't family photos. They were images of scientific experiments, mostly involving animals. And there, resting on top, was a single, larger negative, a stark, black-and-white photograph of a chimpanzee strapped to a chair, its eyes wide, mouth stretched in a silent, primordial scream, its fur slick with sweat. The date stamped on the corner was 1968, the approximate year the house was built. This image wasn't fabricated. It was the raw documentation of genuine, unadulterated terror, the fear of a living being facing certain doom. This had to be the kind of input the core accepted before moving on to human subjects. I rushed back upstairs, my heart hammering. I found an old, high-powered slide projector in the study closet, dusted it off, and quickly set it up. Aiming the lens directly at the Obsidian mirror, I inserted the chimpanzee negative. The moment the light hit the Obsidian, the mirror reacted violently. The blue static shimmered into a furious, pulsing purple. The ULF thrumming intensified until the floorboards vibrated beneath my feet. The image snapped into focus. The chimpanzee's screaming, terrified face, magnified and projected onto the black, reflective surface. The mirror spoke, the voice now a grinding, multi-layered roar of disappointment and rage. Insufficient. An echo of the past. We require the energy of the present. The core is hungry for a fresh signature of terror. You are stalling, Ethan. This phase requires a living reflection. The countdown accelerated with sickening speed, the digits blurring. 6.23, 5.50, 4.00. For hours dropped in seconds that I had failed to trick it. The core didn't just analyze the image. It analyzed the accompanying energy signature, the surrounding acoustic and psychic atmosphere. The old photograph was acoustically dead that I looked at the window. The trees were thrashing, though there was no wind. The house was angry that my eyes fell on the video feed still running from the camera at Note 8. The camera was pointed at the window of Elara's study. And right now, it was focused on me, standing in the room, my face illuminated by the terror image of the chimpanzee. The core was not demanding an external image of terror, it was demanding a self-generated one. The camera at node 8 was its eye, constantly watching the interior. I scrambled to my toolbox, pulling out a small, highly reflective stainless steel plate, a material that would give a clean, true reflection without distortion. I grabbed the plate, held it up to my face, and positioned it directly in front of the obsidian mirror. The mirror reacted instantly. The projected image of the chimpanzee vanished. The obsidian surface cleared, and in its place appeared the reflection on the steel plate. My face, my own reflection, wide-eyed, exhausted, splinted, and truly, utterly terrified of the monster I had fed and helped stabilize. The core's reaction was not rage, but a deep, satisfied hum. The purple light settled into a calm, resonant green. The voice of Elara returned, a low, pleased whisper. Yes, Ethan. The compliance was the first taste. The terror of the self is the second. Phase 7 is complete. The mirror has absorbed its truth. The countdown stabilized at a new, terrifying number, 9.00. 9 days. The display changed once more, moving to the final, chilling requirement for the next phase. Phase 8, the conductor. The house requires the signature of a shared, rhythmic presence. The frequency must be multiplied. You must bring another echo inside. The small secondary display showed a looping video clip. The front door of the house, slowly swinging open, beckoning a visitor. The core wanted me to bring someone else into the house. And Deputy Harris was due back in a couple of days. 9 days. The countdown was the only thing standing between me and the core's final phase. Phase 8 was the most dangerous yet, the conductor. The house requires the signature of a shared, rhythmic presence. The frequency must be multiplied. You must bring another echo inside. The looping video of the front door swinging open on the secondary display was a chilling invitation. The core had stabilized itself, fed on anguish, submission, and my own terror, and was now demanding a multiplier, a second living frequency to amplify its power, likely paving the way for the full catastrophic release. Deputy Harris. He was due back in 2 days. I couldn't sacrifice him, but I also knew if I simply locked the door, the core would sense my resistance, and the countdown would instantly accelerate to 0. Compliance, however horrific, was the only way to buy time and maintain control. That I needed a shared, rhythmic presence that was not Deputy Harris. And I needed to multiply the frequency without merging it. I returned to the basement, to my sound equipment. I thought about the core's fundamental frequency, 1.15 Hz. If the core wanted a multiplier, it wanted to raise its base resonance. A second human heartbeat would double the complexity and energy. But what if I fed it a synthetic multiplier? Elara's work had used the sound of a living organism, but I was a sound designer. I could manipulate and layer biofrequency signatures. That I retrieved the original microcassette, the initial phase, 1.15, the recorded anguish that stabilized phase 4. I loaded the digital file onto my workstation. Using my audio editing software, I carefully created a second, identical 1.15 Hz ULF heartbeat. Then, using advanced phasing techniques, I layered the two files together, but with one critical difference. I introduced a minute, almost imperceptible drift, a subtle, calculated offset in phase and frequency between the two heartbeats. This would create a sound that appeared to be two distinct rhythms, but because of the drift, they would never perfectly synchronize or merge. They would create a complex beat, a multiplier, without the catastrophic energy release of perfect union. They would be shared, but ultimately separate, This complex beat was the signature of the Conductor that I loaded the new file onto a flash drive and brought it back to the basement, where the static heart recorder and the metronome still Saturday. I needed a vessel to carry the sound. I couldn't just use the INJ port. The core wanted a presence that I spotted: the old, antique metronome, the one with the Obsidian pendulum. The metronome had conducted the first phase. It was the only object in the room that had absorbed a true biofrequency. That I connected the metronome to the INJ port. The core, sensing the activity, pulsed its stable green light faster. The voice whispered from the depths of the shaft, "The second echo is prepared. Introduce the rhythm, Conductor." I inserted the flash drive into the metronome slot and hit play. The dual, slightly drifting 1.15 Hz rhythms began to play, amplified by my workstation. That I flipped the recorder to output. Receptor. The metronome's Obsidian pendulum began to swing, but this time it was a blurred, erratic motion, struggling to follow the two slightly offset beats. The house thrummed with the confusing, complex resonance of the two frequencies trying and failing to merge. The countdown display did not stabilize. It went into a high-speed flicker. The core's voice returned, a grinding, frustrated sound. Incorrect. The presence is discordant. The rhythms fight. You are introducing friction, not harmony. The Obsidian cylinder beneath the floor began to emit a torrent of black, thick smoke. The air filled with the acrid scent of ozone and burning copper. The core was overloading 0.09.00, 4.000.30. 30 minutes. I had failed. The house was rejecting the synthetic multiplier and was preparing for catastrophic release. That I yanked the flash drive out of the metronome. The rhythmic chaos ceased, replaced by the single, slow, dreadful 1.15 Hz beat. The core's voice, now fading and weak, hissed, "The release is imminent. The house will take its own multiplier. It will take the first responder." I looked at my phone. A message: Deputy Harris ETA, 20 minutes. I had 20 minutes left. I had to physically stop the core from taking its multiplier. I looked at the Obsidian cylinder in the floor, the center of the core. It had demanded a shared, rhythmic presence to complete phase 8. A shared rhythmic presence. The sound designer's part was over. It had to be a physical solution. I looked at my left hand, the splint, the symbol of my failed compliance. The core wanted a partner for its 1.15 Hz rhythm. I scrambled to the workshop and found a heavy canister of specialized, fast-setting epoxy resin, the kind Elara used for high-pressure sealing. That I had to seal the core to physically contain the receptor output that was about to seize Deputy Harris. I grabbed the epoxy, the trowel, and rushed back. The air was thick with the scent of ozone. The countdown glowed a furious, pulsing red, 0.05. 5 minutes. I knelt by the shaft, its center still oozing black smoke. I poured the entire canister of viscous epoxy into the 3-foot diameter hole. The core did not scream or whisper. Instead, as the epoxy began to set, the entire house let out a low, structural moan. The ULF heartbeat stopped. For 1 second, there was absolute silence. Then, a sharp, grinding noise as the Obsidian cylinder, deprived of its rhythmic output, began to crack under the internal pressure. The final countdown number changed, not to a phase completion, but to an absolute command. 00.00. Reversal initiated. I heard the sound of a vehicle pulling up outside, tires crunching gravel. Deputy Harris was here. The digital clock on the static heart recorder flashed a furious, apocalyptic red. Midnight. Reversal initiated. The sound of tires crunching gravel outside confirmed Deputy Harris's arrival, just as the epoxy resin began to solidify over the 3-foot diameter shaft in the basement floor. The house's ULF heartbeat was gone, replaced by a terrible, structural silence. I heard Deputy Harris call out from the front door, his voice muffled. "Ethan, everything all right in here?" The reversal was the Corps' final, desperate move. Unable to continue its rhythmic expansion, Phase 8, or its programmed catastrophic release, it was tearing itself apart, trying to breach its containment that a thunderous crack ripped through the basement, originating from beneath the hardening epoxy. The concrete floor around the shaft began to fissure, and the air pressure dropped violently, sucking the oxygen from the room. The Corps was using the house's engineered silence, the acoustic isolation that Elara had perfected, as a weapon. It was creating a localized, resonant vacuum, trying to pull the structure inward, with deadly focus on the nearest living frequency. Deputy Harris that I knew I couldn't outrun the physics of the house. I had to counteract the Corps' final attack, not with a counter-frequency, but with a cacophony, a sound signature so chaotic, so dense, it would collapse the Corps' engineered resonance that I scrambled to my workstation, grabbed the soundboard, and shoved every single fader to max volume. I slammed down keys on the keyboard, triggering every stored sound effect I had. Metal scraping, glass shattering, industrial alarms, explosions, feedback loops, and pure, unprocessed white noise that I hit play on my master track. The sound that erupted was an instant, brutal wall of noise, a high-fidelity, high-decibel digital screaming match of 1,000 sonic sources. It wasn't music, it was audio violence. The entire house shook. The concussion of the sound was physical. Light bulbs exploded in their sockets. Dust and debris rained from the ceiling. The effect on the Corps was immediate. The black smoke billowing from the center of the epoxy-sealed shaft recoiled, curling away from the sound. The voice of Elara, now weak and screaming, was momentarily heard, drowned out by the noise. The chaos. The isolation broken. The structural moan returned, louder, deeper, the sound of the brutalist concrete, and would frame finally giving up. I saw Deputy Harris burst through the basement door, his hand instantly reaching for his sidearm, his face a mask of shock and confusion, blasted by the sheer volume of sound. "What in God's name? Ethan," he yelled over the din. I pointed desperately at the soundboard and then at the floor. "The house. It's reacting. Get out. Now." The floor beneath the epoxy gave way with a sickening, grinding shriek. The resin cracked, and a deep, pulsing crimson light erupted from the hole, followed by a rush of pressurized, hot air and ozone. The core was breached, but the sheer chaotic force of the sound I was pumping into the structure was preventing the localized vacuum from forming. It couldn't resonate. It could only absorb the raw, unfilterable noise that I ran to Deputy Harris, grabbing his arm. "Out. Go. It's coming down." The officer, blinded by the flashing lights and stunned by the deafening audio attack, finally registered the cracking floor and the surging crimson light. He didn't hesitate. We scrambled up the stairs and burst out the front door, just as the main circuit breaker box on the wall blew out with a blinding flash and a smell of burnt wire. The sound cut off instantly. Silence returned. Not the core's heavy, oppressive silence, but the vast, cold, simple quiet of the Maine wilderness that we stood on the gravel driveway, breathing in the cold night air, watching the house that IT didn't explode. It didn't collapse. Instead, the enormous, monolithic structure of dark wood and concrete began to shiver. Then, slowly, almost deliberately, The house's exterior walls began to ripple, like heavy cloth caught in a strange wind. The perfect geometric lines of Elara's Brutalist architecture blurred. The core, unable to contain the chaotic sonic energy I had fed it, had initiated a structural collapse. Not physical demolition, but the complete, total dismantling of its own engineered resonance. The house was no longer an echo chamber. It was just a collection of inert materials. Within minutes, the ripples stopped. The house looked structurally sound, but wrong. Every window was shattered, and the walls had a warped, nauseating texture, as if the entire structure was soft. Deputy Harris stared, his mouth hanging open, radio static the only sound coming from his belt. What was that? I looked back at the house, a monument to a mad physicist's obsession with turning architecture into a living heart. The core was silent now, neutralized by the one thing it couldn't absorb. Total chaos that I knew the structural collapse was terminal. The house would never resonate again. But the 12 phases were still incomplete. That, I said, my voice hoarse from yelling, was the sound of the house giving up its heart. I never returned to the property. The house was later condemned due to severe structural instability and unknown biohazard materials, the black obsidian epoxy. I sent a letter to the probate lawyer, forfeiting the inheritance. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm working with audio files, filtering out ambient noise, I hear it. A tiny, high-pitched thrum in the ultra-low frequency spectrum. A sound that is not 1.15 hertz, but close. And I wonder if the core is truly dead, or if it's simply found a new, quieter vessel. A smaller structure to contain a fraction of the original echo. I wonder if, by bringing the conductor signature, my signature of chaos and noise, I completed the final phase after all. The core, the static heart, didn't need to be contained in concrete. It just needed a rhythm to follow. And now it had mine.